saw a picture of us in crop tops with bare stomachs.
We've started reading our son stories at bedtime. Mostly he likes to read a book while we read a book to him, and then he just kind of puts his book down and falls asleep. The sound of us reading to him. And at this point in time, he doesn't really matter what I read to him, so I've actually been reading a book on my Kindle out loud to him. I'm actually reading two different books. So the book that I'm reading to him is called Iron Empires, and that's what I've been reading on Kindle. And additionally, I'm listening to a book called The Edge of Anarchy, The Railroad Barons, The Gilded Age, and the Greatest Labor Uprising. And both of these books are about, pretty much the same time period. And the one that I'm reading is just in the introductory chapter, and it's going over the impact that railroads have had on the United States, particularly in developing the nation as we know it today in terms of industry. And then the one that I'm listening to is a lot of the same things. It focuses a lot around the railroad industry right now. But I know I've talked about this before, but I find it so interesting that the age that we're living in is so it's so similar. It's like a historical reverberation of what happened during the Industrial Revolution. It's all the same plot points. It's technology is stealing our jobs. Immigrants are stealing our jobs. The rich are getting too rich. The poor are getting too poor. The middle class is disappearing. There is no trust in the government's ability to regulate these things. There's failing trust in banking and in financial systems. And then additionally, there's fear / actual realization of the government using its military to police its people. So we've seen that now, that sort of narrative of the militarized police, tanks and things going to small town cops. And that was similarly what was happening during the revolution, or the Industrial Revolution. There were lots of labor riots that would go up. The military would come in, the federal military would come in, and they would bust up picket lines, they'd bust up riots, things like that. And so it's a topic that I'm fascinated in, but it's a topic that I can relate to. I can relate to what's happening. And what's interesting is, particularly in this one about trains, is that so much of the fear of what trains were doing to the United States at the time is similar to the same fears that we have with things like AI right now, where we're sort of questioning, is because we're able to create so much wealth with these technologies, does it even mean that it's a good thing? Henry David Thoreau spoke a lot about his concerns with what the rail lines were doing, because for so much of the United States sort of pioneer history, when you think of good old classic folklore of the United States citizen, it's been that, farmers who could always be very self-sufficient, because at the time, if you didn't like the hustle and bustle of the city of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or even Chicago, and you didn't like the way that things were going, you could always pack up your family, pack up your wagon, and go out west and claim some land and start a farm and get away. And so that was the frontier. The frontier was this promised land, this kind of promise that no matter how bad things you got, you could always go out and start over and presumably find some amount of success and self-reliance out west. But then when they created the Transcontinental Railroad, and that was completed, even though it wasn't really transcontinental, but when that first golden spike was laid in Utah, it was really symbolic of that the frontier had moved and it had disappeared. It hit the other side. So there was no longer this kind of secret Western Wild West area of the United States anymore. It was all now being industrialized. It was all now being controlled by these oil and railroad and steel barons who, were going in and they were creating vast amounts of wealth, but it wasn't always necessarily well distributed. And so it was that same thing. People were frustrated. They felt like no longer were they putting in a hard day's work for a hard day's pay. It was a hard day's work for $1 a day. That was the dollar a day. The dollar a day workers was the working class at the time, and it was really bad working conditions. There was very little democracy in the workplace. And so there was a labor uprising. And I think we are seeing that now. Maybe the beginning of an uprising, or maybe we're in it. I don't quite know. Only time will tell. But even things like COVID, people demanding working from home, people demanding better health insurance from their company, people demanding better pay, higher minimum wage, more vacation time, freedom, family, all this. And I think what a lot of these laborers were doing was not only obviously trying to improve their material surroundings, but they were also just trying to make a claim that their voice mattered, that their labor mattered, that their families mattered. And I feel the same sort of vibe today that, when people talk about raising the minimum wage, sure, of course, it is about making more money and being able to live, but it's also, I think, even louder or subconsciously about, hey, I matter and you should value me. And same thing, I think during the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of it, there was so much change and there was so much wealth being gathered that people felt like the country was now being controlled by capitalism, which is very similar today. There's also so many interesting things that I think railroads specifically sort of kickstarted in hand with telegraph. Now I'm overthinking the word. It's telegraph, right? The beep, 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 beep. Telegram? Oh, yeah. Okay. Telegraph. Wow. A telegram is what's sent. I had a complete brain melt. What was I even saying? Oh, yeah. The railroad system and the telegraph did in terms of connecting. It connected. There's a quote. I forget who said it, but it was like, with the telegram, Texas and Maine can now talk to each other, but what if they don't have anything to say? Which sounds kind of silly, but I think the idea, if I'm not mistaken, was about like, if they don't have anything to say, they'll find something to say to each other, which kind of like wasn't necessarily a good thing, which is like, that's also sort of what people kind of make fun of, both jokingly and seriously, about social media. Is like, okay, well, who cares about your tweet or your status or your Instagram picture? Anyways, whatever. But there was so much social change that came along with that. Something that this book points out that I find particularly interesting is how it really was one of a beginning fulcrum for women's rights and women having freedom and their ability to participate in society, specifically by when now business was happening cross country, cross the nation. These businessmen were now taking their wives along with them. So a lot of these women who are traditionally just kind of stuck in the household, raising kids, making dinner, and they might go out in town, they were never seen in a business environment particularly. But now there were businessmen on Pullman cars, which were these really, really high-end cars. Like, think of first class airliners today, or even, let's even go further, even more like private jet. It was like that level of wealth and business, and now you had women who were on those train cars and they were being seen by other businessmen and they were privy to conversations about business, whether or not they could participate in them, right? But then additionally, now women could travel, that sort of like melded into women being able to travel by themselves or in groups, and that kickstarted, like, very famously, the Chicago World's Fair in 1885. There was a complete outpouring of women because they now had the right to work. And so they would get on these trains, these really young women, they go out and get trains. And sometimes they were going somewhere new for the very first time in their life. And that was kind of one of the things, is a little off topic, but you may have heard of H.H. Holmes, who was America's very first documented serial killer. And he was killing primarily these young women who were coming to the World's Fair for promise of work in Chicago. And they were getting off the trains. They didn't really know what they were doing. They weren't used to being exposed to like whatever. So they, at the time, they were easily taken advantage of just due to, I think, ignorance and lack of world experience. And that's a horrible, I'm just bringing it up as kind of a connection. But I think women had an incredible like sense of freedom suddenly. Minor. I mean, I think trains, I think they just gave everybody a certain level of freedom in terms of industry and societal opportunities. I don't know. I find I'm endlessly fascinated in sort of the Gilded Age. I'm endlessly fascinated in the wealth garnering of that period of time in America. There was so much change. And I think trains are just the center point of what sparked that, because they certainly did not expect the rapid capitalism growth due to trains. Like there was something where in 1865, I'm going to get these numbers a little bit wrong, but in 1865 there was like 70,000 miles of laid train track in the United States. And then in 1884, there was 114, or like 100,000. And then in 1885, there was 160,000. Like it grew exponentially, the amount of trains, and therefore it grew exponentially the amount of business and just connection. And it really was the beginning of the end of a world that is not so, we live in one big society now. And I don't think previously it was like that. And to go back to it, I think there's so much American folk that yearn for that time. I think even my generation is only really 2 generations removed from a people that really felt that for real. I've never actually, even if you go to middle America, I still have a phone in my pocket. They still have MTV. I can go talk to anybody in Nebraska and they've heard of DJ Khaled. But there was a time where people didn't. And that's also, now I'm just getting into a tangent. That's also what's so interesting to me about the circus at that time. The circus was, if you account for inflation and costs and everything, the Barnum and Bailey Circus was the most profitable entertainment endeavor in human history, even to this day. It was the most successful entertainment endeavor. And something that was so crucial to that was the fact that people were so unconnected to the rest of the world. So you could fill up a cart full of, weird performers, weird people, exotic animals, and you could roll into town. I mean, there's like this idea that I love to think about of if it was 1890 and you were living in Amherst, New Hampshire, and you had only heard about an elephant or maybe seen a drawing of it in a book, and suddenly here comes 16 elephants marching down your main street, and then they set up tents bigger than 3 times the size of the largest building you've ever been inside of, and then people are dancing. You see people from Africa and Asia, and they're doing crazy things, and like, why would you not want to go see that the next, I don't think they came yearly. I'm not sure on that, but there's something so wondrous and magical almost about that time. And I know that right now I'm living in something that could be considered wonderful and magical, but when you're living in it, it's just hard to view it that way. Anyways, I've been talking 20 minutes, but yeah, Industrial Revolution, fascinating to me. And that period of time from like 1850 to 1930 is just endless interestingness to me. Cool.
I saw a picture